Hello everyone, and welcome back to another GIS lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to cover the idea of visual variables, in particular how those visual variables relate to the qualitative, which are the nominal and the ordinal levels of measurement, versus quantitative, or the interval and ratio levels of measurement. And so as I mentioned in the introduction video, even though we have three visual variables associated with color, we're going to largely ignore those for now and cover them in a separate lecture series when we talk about color. So let's go ahead and dive into talking about visual variables. And what I want to do is I want to break them down by qualitative and quantitative. So as I talk about each one, I want to come back up here and describe whether or not they're most useful for qualitative, quantitative, or maybe in a couple of cases for both. So before we dive into the first visual variable, again, just to reiterate, qualitative here is going to be the non-numeric. So it's going to be things that have either no ranking at all or a non-numeric ranking. So these are the nominal and the ordinal. The quantitative being interval and ratio. So our first visual variable is going to be the idea of spacing. Let's scroll down just a little bit and give us a little bit more space here. Space for spacing. So spacing. The way that spacing works is spacing deals with the distance between marks that make up a symbol. Right, and so what do I mean by that? Well, if we think about, for example, say we have let's say we have 3 polygons here, right? I'm going to number them in blue just so we can keep track of them, right? 1, 2, 3, right? And over here we have the attribute table, right? It does not, I'm keeping these abstract because I want to prove that this is not necessarily dependent on a particular variable, but rather on the category of the attribute itself. But I'm saying 1, 2, and 3 here just so that we know that they are truly different. They're not the same. So when I say that spacing is the distance between marks that make up a symbol, let's say that we have 3 different polygons with 3 different values. What we could do here is we could do something like this, right? If we're going to represent them with a pattern, actually that's a good point. They make up a symbol pattern. Right, so let's say that we wanted to represent these with spacing by having some combination of horizontal lines making up the that make up the pattern of the polygon. And I'm going to make the outlines red just so that we don't get confused here. So the red outlines here, these are the outlines of the actual polygons. and I've numbered them so that we can keep track of which polygon is which. And again, 3 different values. So with spacing, what we're saying is we're going to change the distance between the marks that make up the symbol pattern. So in this case, the symbol pattern is going to be horizontal lines. So in 1, right, you can see that they're this far apart. To differentiate between 2, what I can do is I can intentionally make them farther apart. Right? 1 is closer together than 2, and then 3, right? We can make 3, right, even farther apart. Right? So the distance, let me do this in a different color here. Right? The distance between consecutive lines in the symbols right, that is spacing. Right, so having symbols closer, having the pattern or the symbols in the pattern be closer together versus farther apart, that is how we represent spacing as a visual variable. And if we do the same thing with lines, so this is polygons, or if we do the same thing with lines, right, we could do dashed lines. So we could do something like 1, 2, 3, right? For example, versus something like right, the distance, right, the distance between the dashes right, that's spacing. Now for points, I would not recommend points, simply because of the fact that with points, it gets very difficult because you essentially are applying the same concept as polygons. But on point data, it's not recommended. So to recap with spacing, right, we're adjusting the distance between the marks that make up the symbol or the pattern for the symbol. So for polygons, right, it's the distance between whatever we're calling for the repeated pattern, in this case, horizontal lines. With lines, typically you're going to make a dashed line, and it's going to be the distance between the dashes. So let's talk about whether or not spacing is good for nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. So here's the reality of it. You, generally speaking, do not want to apply this to ordinal data. Or sorry, nominal data. Right, so not good for nominal data. The reason I say that is you have to think for a second. With nominal data, the goal is to not imply any sort of ranking or order, right? Again, if we think back to the idea of names, right? If we wanted to represent the names by this symbology, we want to make sure that we're not improperly implying that one name is better than another. And the thing with spacing is that the distance, or should I say, the distance between the spaces, right, creates a density, right? This polygon number 1 here, the lines are more dense than number 3. And the problem with implying density is that density turns around and implies importance or ranking, right? So to sort of wrap this up, spacing implies density, density implies ranking. right? And the idea here is that we do not want to imply ranking, therefore we would not use this for nominal. That being said, it works well for ordinal because for the same reason, right? Spacing implies density, density implies a ranking, so we can use spacing for ordinal, and we can use it for interval and ratio. So let's go back up here to our visual variables. So for qualitative, right, spacing for ordinal only, right? Quantitative, definitely you can use spacing. So spacing is a good variable for quantitative, and it's a good variable if the qualitative variable is ordinal. So hopefully spacing makes sense. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.